What if Snape never loved Lily? Part 1. Severus Snape was a boy of sharp intellect and ruthless ambition. From the moment he stepped into Hogwarts, he knew what he wanted: power, knowledge, and the means to rise above the world that had belittled him. Unlike in another reality, where the love of a Muggle-born girl softened the sharp edges of his soul, this Severus never spared Lily Evans a second glance. She was just another student, another obstacle to surpass in his pursuit of greatness. Instead of forming a childhood bond with her, Severus devoted himself entirely to magic. His fascination with the dark arts consumed him, drawing him deeper into its mysteries. He found allies in Lucius Malfoy, Avery, and Mulciber, young Slytherins who shared his thirst for power. Without Lily's friendship to ground him, he never wavered in his loyalty to them. When they spoke of the Dark Lord, of the purity of blood and the power he promised, Severus listened with keen interest. By his third year, Severus had already begun crafting his own spells. He modified jinxes, created hexes, and even dabbled in dangerous potions that most students wouldn't dare attempt. His talent didn't go unnoticed. Horace Slughorn, intrigued by the boy's raw potential, tried to bring him into his circle, but Severus wasn't interested in socializing with those he deemed unworthy of his intellect. Slughorn's favorites, Lily included, meant nothing to him. Without Lily's intervention, James Potter and his friends had no reason to hesitate in their torment of Snape. The rivalry was just as fierce, but without the hope of winning Lily's favor, James never viewed Snape as anything more than an annoying, arrogant opponent. The Marauders still hexed him, still mocked him, but Snape endured. He learned. Every humiliation only pushed him further into the shadows, sharpening his hatred, feeding his ambition. By his 5th year, Severus had already secured his place as one of the most promising students in Slytherin. When the Marauders attempted to humiliate him by hanging him upside down in front of the school, he didn't curse at them or lash out with emotion. He studied them, watched their spells, memorized their movements. Instead of calling Lily a slur in a fit of anger, as he might have in another life, he bided his time. And when the moment was right, he struck back. James had just come out of transfiguration when his legs suddenly collapsed beneath him. His body twisted unnaturally as he fell, completely paralyzed. A second later, he was flung against the corridor wall with a force that left him gasping for air. The students who witnessed it barely had time to react before Snape appeared, his wand raised, a smirk playing at his lips. James struggled, trying to reach for his wand, but his limbs wouldn't cooperate. A curse meant to humiliate Snape had been transformed into something far worse, and James knew it. "You always thought yourself untouchable, Potter," Snape said, his voice eerily calm. "But you were never as clever as you believed." It took 3 professors to undo Snape's spell, and though he was given detention, something changed that day. James Potter no longer saw Severus Snape as just another Slytherin punching bag. He saw a rival. By his 6th year, Snape was already well on his way to joining the Death Eaters. With no attachments to hold him back, his loyalty to Voldemort was unwavering. He admired the Dark Lord's vision, his power, his promise of a world where the strong ruled over the weak. Dumbledore, seeing the dangerous path Snape was taking, attempted to reach out to him. But without love or friendship to anchor him, Severus saw no reason to listen to the old man. Lily Evans, too, barely crossed his mind. Without his love for her, he never spied on her, never felt jealousy over her relationship with James. To him, she was just another student, another face lost in the crowd. So when Voldemort marked her son for death, Severus didn't plead for her life. There was no desperate bargain with Dumbledore, no switch in allegiance. He did as he was commanded. And so, on that fateful night in Godric's Hollow, there was no hesitation. When Voldemort entered the house, James fell as he had in every timeline. But this time, when Lily stood in front of her son, she had no secret protector. No one had begged for her life. Voldemort raised his wand. Lily screamed. And then she was gone. Harry Potter did not survive that night. The killing curse struck him as it had struck his mother. The prophecy was broken, and the wizarding world fell into darkness. Severus Snape, Death Eater, stood beside his master as the world changed forever. The Dark Lord reigned supreme. With the Potter child dead and the prophecy broken, there was no one left to stand in his way. The Order of the Phoenix fought valiantly, but without the boy who lived, their resistance faltered. Dumbledore still led them, but his influence weakened with each passing day. One by one, Voldemort's forces crushed the opposition, and the Ministry of Magic fell under his control. Severus Snape stood at his master's side, watching as the world reshaped itself under Voldemort's rule. He had no regrets. He had made no desperate deals to save Lily Evans, no last-minute change of heart. She had been just another casualty in a war that had been destined to end this way. To Snape, love had always been a weakness, an illusion that clouded judgment. He had seen what it did to fools like Potter, how it made them reckless, vulnerable. He had never allowed himself such folly. But power, that was real. Snape's loyalty earned him a high rank among the Death Eaters. He became Voldemort's trusted potions master, developing powerful elixirs and poisons to aid in the Dark Lord's conquest. His skill with the dark arts made him invaluable, and his ruthless efficiency gained him the respect of his fellow Death Eaters. Even Bellatrix Lestrange, who had once viewed him with suspicion, acknowledged his worth. Yet, despite his success, Snape's mind remained as sharp and calculating as ever. He saw things others ignored: the arrogance of the Dark Lord, the overconfidence in his own invincibility. Snape had no intention of becoming another blind follower. He served Voldemort, yes, but he also observed. He learned. Dumbledore had retreated to Hogwarts, the last true sanctuary of the light. Though the castle still stood under the protection of ancient magic, it was only a matter of time before Voldemort breached its walls. Many of the school's staff had fled or gone into hiding, but those who remained, McGonagall, Flitwick, even that fool Hagrid, fought to keep hope alive. But hope was a fragile thing. By the time Snape stepped foot in Hogwarts again, it was not as a student, nor as a secret agent working against the Dark Lord, but as the victor returning to a conquered land. The Death Eaters stormed the castle, their spells shattering the once impenetrable defenses. The Great Hall became a battlefield. McGonagall fought with a fury that belied her age, striking down Death Eaters with wand work as precise as it was relentless. Flitwick held his own, his diminutive frame darting through the chaos as he unleashed powerful charms. Even Hagrid, armed with nothing but his brute strength and his enormous crossbow, tore through the enemy ranks. But it wasn't enough. Dumbledore himself stood in the center of it all, his wand moving with impossible speed, his eyes burning with the knowledge that this was the end. He faced Voldemort, the two greatest wizards of their time locked in a duel that shook the very foundations of the castle. Fire and lightning clashed, ancient spells clashing with the darkest magic ever known. And then Severus Snape made his choice. Not out of love, not out of regret, but because he understood something that even the Dark Lord did not. Power was never permanent. Every empire fell, every ruler met their end. Snape had spent his life seeking knowledge, and in that knowledge he found the truth. Voldemort was not invincible. He was a parasite, feeding on fear and chaos. And like all parasites, he could be removed. So, as Dumbledore struggled against the Dark Lord's might, Snape did what no one expected. He betrayed Voldemort. The moment was swift. A flick of his wand, a whispered incantation. A curse, ancient and deadly, designed to strike when least expected. Voldemort turned, his red eyes widening for the first time in true shock, as Snape's spell struck him in the chest. The Dark Lord staggered, his inhuman face twisting in fury. He raised his wand, but Dumbledore, ever the strategist, seized the opportunity. A single final spell. Voldemort screamed as the magic engulfed him. His body, once so feared, withered before their eyes. The Death Eaters, seeing their master fall, fled in terror. And Severus Snape stood there, watching as the Dark Lord was destroyed. Not by a prophecy, not by a child, but by the one man who had never loved, never wavered, and never believed in anything but power itself. The battle was over. The Dark Lord had fallen, not by the hand of a prophesied hero, but by Severus Snape, the man who had never believed in destiny or love. Hogwarts stood in ruins, the air thick with the scent of burnt stone and the echoes of fading spells. The few surviving Death Eaters had either fled or been captured. Dumbledore stood in the center of the Great Hall, his robes tattered, his face carved with exhaustion. He studied Snape carefully, as if trying to decipher the mind of the man who had just delivered the wizarding world's salvation. "You betrayed him," Dumbledore said at last, his voice quiet but firm. Snape straightened his shoulders, his expression unreadable. "I did what was necessary." McGonagall, still gripping her wand, stepped forward. "And why should we trust you now? You fought on his side for years. You killed, you tortured." "I followed him because I knew he would fall," Snape interrupted, his voice as smooth as ever. "I played the long game, Professor. And I won." Silence stretched between them. The surviving members of the Order of the Phoenix shifted uneasily, unsure whether to see Snape as a hero or a traitor. Dumbledore studied him for a long moment before speaking again. "You understand, of course, that this does not absolve you of everything you have done." Snape smirked. "I never expected absolution. I simply expect recognition of my usefulness." Dumbledore sighed. "And what do you propose we do with you, Severus?" A flicker of something, perhaps amusement, perhaps something darker, passed through Snape's eyes. "That depends, Headmaster. Do you truly believe that the fall of Voldemort means the war is over?" Dumbledore's gaze sharpened. He knew better than anyone that war left scars, that power did not simply vanish with the death of a tyrant. The Ministry was in ruins, the wizarding world shaken to its core. Chaos would follow. "You intend to remain in the shadows," Dumbledore murmured, understanding now. Snape inclined his head. "Someone must. There are still those loyal to him, those who would seek to rise in his place. I know their faces, their secrets, their weaknesses." His lips curled into a thin smile. "You need me, whether you trust me or not." McGonagall still looked wary, but Dumbledore, always the strategist, nodded slowly. "Very well, Severus. You will remain at Hogwarts under my watch. But understand this, you will be held accountable for your actions." Snape inclined his head, unbothered. "I would expect nothing less. Hogwarts would be rebuilt, but the world would never be the same. The boy who lived had never existed. The prophecy had never come to pass. And yet, Voldemort had been defeated. Not by love, not by fate, but by the cunning of a man who had never allowed himself to be blinded by either." As Snape turned away from the ruins of the Great Hall, he felt no triumph, no satisfaction. Only the knowledge that, once again, he had survived. And in the end, that was all that had ever mattered. The war had ended, but the shadows it cast remained. The wizarding world was in turmoil, its foundations cracked by years of fear and bloodshed. The Ministry, once a symbol of order, was in disarray. Those who had served Voldemort in secret now scrambled to either hide their allegiances or seize what power remained. And in the midst of it all, Severus Snape walked through the ruins of Hogwarts, unchanged by victory or defeat. Dumbledore had allowed him to stay, but the whispers had already begun. The students who had survived the siege regarded him with suspicion, and even the staff, those who had once been his colleagues, watched him with unease. To them, he was not a hero. He was a man who had played both sides, a man who had killed and betrayed until the very end. But Snape did not seek their approval. He spent his days rebuilding the potions classroom, restoring the shattered shelves, and gathering what remained of the rare ingredients lost in the battle. It was a task that required precision, and precision kept his mind sharp. It kept him from dwelling on the emptiness that came after a war. Dumbledore visited him often, watching him with that infuriating gaze that suggested he knew more than he let on. "You do not seem like a man at peace, Severus," the old wizard said one evening as he observed Snape brewing a potion. Snape did not look up. "Peace is an illusion, Headmaster. There is only power shifting hands from one fool to another." Dumbledore sighed. "And yet, you chose to take that power away from Voldemort." Snape finally turned, his dark eyes unreadable. "Because I knew what he was. A tyrant without foresight. Power means nothing if it is wasted." Dumbledore studied him for a moment. "And what do you intend to do with your power now?" Snape smirked, though there was no humor in it. "Survive. As I always have. But survival would not be so simple. The remnants of the Death Eaters still lurked in the shadows, plotting their next move. Many had been captured, but others had slipped through the cracks, and whispers of revenge spread like poison through the underground circles of the wizarding world. Snape received the first warning one night as he returned to his chambers. A single piece of parchment lay on his desk, written in dark, jagged ink. "Traitor, you will not be forgiven." He burned the note without a second thought. Let them come. He had played the game longer than any of them, and he was still standing. But Dumbledore was not so dismissive. They will not stop, Severus, the old man warned. They see you as the one who struck the killing blow, and those who worshipped Voldemort will never forget that. Snape leaned back in his chair, unbothered. I have dealt with worse. Dumbledore's expression darkened. Perhaps. But tell me, Severus, what will you do if the Ministry does not see you as a hero either? Snape's fingers curled slightly. The Wisengamot will demand trials, Dumbledore continued. They will want justice for the crimes committed during the war. Justice, Snape scoffed. Or vengeance? Dumbledore did not answer. Snape already knew the truth. He had seen it before. How quickly people turned on those who no longer served their purpose. He had been useful in bringing down Voldemort, but now? Now he was simply a reminder of the darkness that had nearly consumed them all. The question was not whether they would come for him. The question was when. And Severus Snape was always prepared. The trial was inevitable. Snape had expected it the moment Voldemort fell. The wizarding world needed someone to blame, someone to answer for the atrocities committed under the Dark Lord's rule. They had no Harry Potter to hail as a savior, no prophesied hero to distract them. Instead, they had Severus Snape, the man who had played both sides until the very end. The Ministry did not see a reluctant spy who had ensured Voldemort's downfall. They saw a Death Eater who had betrayed his own master only when it suited him. And so, he stood before the Wisengamot, bound by enchanted chains, while a room full of self-righteous fools debated whether he deserved freedom or Azkaban. Severus Snape, intoned the Minister for Magic, his voice heavy with judgment. You were known to have served Lord Voldemort for years. You participated in acts of violence against those who opposed him, carried out his orders without question, and worked against the Ministry. Do you deny this? Snape's face remained unreadable. No. A murmur rippled through the chamber. Some looked smug, others disgusted. None of them understood. And yet, the Minister continued, you claim to have worked against him in secret, that your betrayal was planned all along. He leaned forward slightly. Why should we believe you? Snape's lip curled. Because if I had been loyal to the Dark Lord, you would not be standing here asking that question. More whispers. More uncertainty. They wanted to hate him, but the truth was inconvenient. Dumbledore, seated among the members of the Wisengamot, finally spoke. Severus Snape was instrumental in the defeat of Voldemort, he said, his voice carrying over the noise. Without him, the war would not have ended as it did. And yet he did nothing out of compassion or regret, interjected a witch with graying hair. We have reports that he expressed no remorse for those who died under his watch, that he never once sought to protect the innocent, only to gain an advantage. Snape's gaze was cold as he met her eyes. And yet the war is over. The chamber fell silent. Dumbledore sighed but did not argue. He understood better than anyone that Snape had never been a hero. A pause. Then the Minister spoke again. Severus Snape, in light of your role in Voldemort's downfall, the Wisengamot is willing to offer you a choice. He glanced at the parchment in his hands. You may be imprisoned in Azkaban for your past crimes, or you may accept exile from Britain, a lifetime of isolation in a foreign land. Snape considered the offer. Azkaban was not an option. He had seen what it did to men like him, those with too many ghosts, too many sins. The Dementors would not break him. They would only strip him of what little remained. Exile, however, there was something almost amusing about it. The idea of disappearing into the world, vanishing from the history books while the so-called heroes of the war continued their petty struggles for power. He smirked. I accept exile. The verdict was given. He was escorted out of the Ministry by Aurors, their wands trained on him as if he were still a threat. Perhaps he was. Dumbledore was waiting at the exit, his blue eyes unreadable. You could have fought harder, the old wizard said quietly. I would have defended you. Snape raised an eyebrow. And what would have been the point? I have never cared for the approval of others. Dumbledore exhaled, looking weary. Where will you go? Snape glanced toward the open doors, where the world beyond awaited. Wherever I please. He stepped into the unknown without looking back. The cold wind of Eastern Europe bit at Snape's skin as he stepped off the carriage. He had traveled far from Britain, through nameless villages and forgotten roads, until he arrived in a land untouched by the ministry's reach. Here, in the shadows of towering mountains and dense forests, no one whispered the name Voldemort. No one knew or cared who Severus Snape was. And that suited him perfectly. He settled in a remote town where magic was practiced in hushed secrecy. It was a place of old traditions, where wizards lived among muggles, hiding in plain sight. There were no grand duels, no ministry interference, just quiet survival. Snape rented a small cottage on the outskirts, away from the villagers, and spent his days gathering ingredients from the wild, brewing potions that few could master. It was a lonely existence, but he did not mind. He had never been a man who sought companionship. But the world had a way of dragging him back into conflict. One evening, as he prepared a restorative draft, a sharp knock echoed through his cottage. He ignored it at first. Few knew of his presence, and he had no interest in visitors. But the knocking persisted, urgent and relentless. Annoyed, he flicked his wand, unlocking the door. A young woman stumbled inside, clutching her arm, her robes torn and bloody. She was barely more than a girl, no older than 19, with wild black hair and terrified eyes. "They're coming," she gasped, collapsing against the wooden table. Snape's eyes narrowed. "Who?" She shook her head, breathing heavily. "The hunters. They know." Snape knelt beside her, examining the wound on her arm. A deep gash, inflicted by something more than just a blade. Dark magic clung to the edges, eating away at the flesh. He recognized it instantly. "Blood curses," he muttered. "Crude work, but effective." The girl whimpered. "You have to help me." Snape stood, retrieving a vial from his shelves. "Drink this." She hesitated, staring at the deep purple liquid. "How do I know I can trust you?" He gave her a withering look. "You don't. But unless you wish to lose that arm, I suggest you do as I say." She drank. The effect was immediate. The curse hissed as it met the potion, the dark veins along her wound fading slightly. She let out a sharp breath, her body sagging in relief. Snape studied her carefully. "Now explain." The girl hesitated, as if debating whether to trust him. But she had no other choice. "There's a group," she said finally. "They call themselves the Order of St. Relicus. Witch hunters." She shivered. "They believe all magic is corrupt. And they've been hunting us, anyone with magic, no matter the bloodline." Snape's expression remained unreadable. He had thought he had left war behind, that he had finally escaped the endless cycle of conflict. And yet, here it was, knocking on his door once more. He sighed, rubbing his temples. "Foolish girl, you've brought them straight to me." The fear in her eyes deepened. "Please, I had nowhere else to go." Snape glanced toward the window, sensing the shift in the air. The hunters were close. He had spent years evading enemies, blending into the shadows, but this was different. This was a fight that had come to him. He had a choice: hand the girl over and remain hidden, or involve himself in yet another battle. Severus Snape had never been a hero, but he did not take kindly to being hunted. The stillness of the night was deceptive. Snape could feel it, the unnatural quiet that came before an attack. The girl, still pale and trembling, sat near the dying fire, her breathing uneven. He had healed her wound as best he could, but her presence had already set events in motion. The Order of St. Relicus would come, and Snape would be ready. Moving with practiced precision, he retrieved a small wooden case from beneath the floorboards. Inside were vials filled with thick, viscous liquids, potions of his own making, crafted for survival rather than healing. With the flick of his wand, he transfigured the room, shifting shelves to conceal the girl and darkening the corners so that shadows stretched unnaturally across the space. He did not run. If there was one thing Snape despised, it was being forced into a fight. But if the fight came to him, he would end it quickly. A heavy silence settled over the cottage. Then footsteps. Soft at first, careful. Someone was testing the wards. Snape remained still, listening. A second set of footsteps followed, then a third. They moved with the precision of trained killers. Not Aurors. Not ordinary mercenaries. These were hunters. A sharp crack. The protective charms on his door shattered. A gust of cold air swept through as the door swung open, revealing 3 figures in dark cloaks. Their faces were hidden behind carved masks, their presence radiating an unnatural stillness. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then the tallest of the three stepped forward. His voice was smooth, almost polite. Severus Snape. Snape raised an eyebrow. Ah, my reputation precedes me. The man chuckled, the sound devoid of humor. You've been living quietly, Professor. We have no quarrel with you. His gaze flickered past Snape, toward the shadows. But you are harboring a fugitive. Hand her over, and we will leave. Snape tilted his head, considering. Interesting proposition. The man waited. Then, in one swift motion, Snape flicked his wrist. A vial shattered against the floor, releasing a thick green mist. The reaction was immediate. One of the hunters staggered back, coughing violently as the mist wrapped around him. The second lunged. Snape was faster. With a flick of his wand, the hunter's own momentum was turned against him, sending him crashing into the far wall. The leader remained still. Poison? He mused, watching as his companion collapsed. Or something worse? Snape allowed himself a smirk. I suppose you'll find out soon enough. The leader's wand snapped up, too late. Snape was already moving. A nonverbal curse shot from his wand, striking the man's chest and sending him sprawling. Before the hunter could recover, Snape was upon him, pressing the tip of his wand to his throat. I suggest you reconsider your career choices, Snape murmured. The hunter's breathing was shallow. You're protecting her? Snape's grip tightened. He had never cared for heroics. He had spent years ensuring his own survival at the expense of others. But this was different. He had left Britain to escape war. Now war had followed him, and he was not in the habit of losing. I suggest, Snape said coldly, that you tell your order this village is off limits. The hunter's expression twisted into something unreadable. Then, with a sharp movement, he vanished in a burst of smoke, leaving his fallen companions behind. Snape exhaled slowly. He knew what would come next. The Order of St. Relicus would not forget this night. But neither would he. The remnants of the battle lingered in the air. The acrid scent of burnt fabric, the faint traces of dark magic that clung to the wooden walls. Snape stood motionless, wand still raised, as the last echoes of his duel faded into silence. The two fallen hunters remained unconscious, sprawled across the floor like discarded puppets. He turned toward the girl. She had pressed herself into the shadows, wide-eyed and breathless. She had seen something few had, the raw, unrelenting precision of Severus Snape in combat. You should have left, he said, his voice low. She swallowed hard. I had nowhere else to go. Snape's expression did not soften. And now they know where I am. The words hung between them, heavy with implication. He had spent years ensuring he was forgotten, carving out a life away from the wars of wizards. Now, in the span of a single night, that fragile existence had been shattered. He exhaled sharply. There was no use in regrets. We need to move, he said. The girl hesitated. Move? Where? Snape flicked his wand. The unconscious hunters were lifted into the air, their bodies hovering as he directed them toward the door. Far from here. They'll return soon, and I'd rather not be here when they do. The girl hesitated, then nodded. Outside, the night was colder than before, the wind carrying whispers through the trees. Snape dragged the hunters toward the edge of the village, where an abandoned well stood half-covered in ivy. With a flick of his wrist, he sent their bodies tumbling into the darkness below. They would wake eventually, disoriented and far from help. By then, he would be long gone. He turned back to the girl. Name? She blinked. What? Your name? He repeated, his patience thin. She hesitated, as if the question itself was dangerous. Elena. Snape studied her. Elena, he said slowly, I hope you understand the depth of the mess you've created. She bit her lip, guilt flickering across her face. I didn't mean to. Intentions mean nothing, he cut in. Only actions. And you've ensured that neither of us can remain here. Elena looked away, but she did not argue. Snape straightened his cloak. Come. We leave now. She hesitated. Where? Snape glanced at the horizon, where the first traces of dawn were beginning to bleed into the sky. Somewhere they won't find us, he said. And with that, they vanished into the night. The world twisted around them as they apparat, the air compressing and then expanding violently as Snape and Elena landed in a dense forest. The trees loomed tall, their branches forming a near-impenetrable canopy, casting everything in deep shadows despite the approaching dawn. The ground was damp beneath their feet, and the distant hoot of an owl was the only sound breaking the eerie silence. Elena stumbled slightly upon landing, clutching her arms for warmth. "Where are we?" she asked, her voice hoarse. Snape scanned the surroundings before answering. The Blackwood, a forest in Eastern Europe, unmarked on Muggle maps and warded against most magical tracking methods. Elena shivered. "So we're safe." Snape let out a dry chuckle. "For now." He flicked his wand, clearing a small patch of ground where he transfigured some leaves into a rough blanket. "Rest. You'll need your strength." Elena hesitated but obeyed, wrapping the blanket around herself. "You didn't have to help me," she murmured. "You could have left me behind." Snape gave her a cold, unreadable look. "Believe me, I considered it." She flinched at the bluntness, but Snape wasn't in the mood to soften his words. His life had been uprooted because of her presence. The Order of St. Relicus would not stop until they found her again. And now they would be hunting him too. He needed answers. Turning sharply, he conjured a blue flame, its glow flickering against the bark of the trees. "Tell me everything," he demanded. Elena looked up, eyes reflecting the firelight. "About what? Why they want you?" She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the blanket. "Do not lie," Snape warned. "I've dealt with enough deception for a lifetime." Elena swallowed hard. "I was part of their order, once." Snape narrowed his eyes. "You worked for them?" She nodded. "Not by choice. I was taken when I was young, raised within their ranks. They train us to be loyal." She looked down. "But I found something I wasn't supposed to. A secret. And I ran." Snape's jaw tightened. He had suspected as much. Few escaped groups like the Order of St. Relicus alive. If they were hunting her this desperately, she must have knowledge they could not afford to let loose. "What secret?" he asked, his tone edged with danger. Elena hesitated, then finally whispered. "They're searching for something, an artifact of great power. They think it can alter the nature of magic itself." Snape's fingers twitched. This was worse than he thought. Artifacts of power were dangerous enough, but anything capable of altering magic itself was beyond reckless. "You understand," he said slowly, "that if they believe you know anything, they will never stop hunting you." Elena looked up, her eyes haunted. "I know." Snape studied her, calculating. He could walk away now, leave her to fend for herself. It would be the logical choice. But logic had not been a luxury he had followed in years. His fate was now entwined with hers. "Get some rest," he said, dousing the flame. "We leave at dawn." Elena nodded, curling into the blanket. Snape remained awake, his wand in hand, watching the darkness. He had a feeling their real battle had just begun. Snape remained motionless, his back pressed against the rough bark of a tree. The forest around him was silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the cold wind. Elena had fallen asleep at last, her breathing slow and even. But Snape did not allow himself that luxury. Too many years in the Dark Lord's service had taught him one thing. Letting your guard down was an invitation for death. His mind worked through the details of her story. The Order of St. Relicus, an artifact capable of altering magic itself. These were not trivial matters, and if what Elena claimed was true, the implications were catastrophic. He had no interest in heroics, but if the Order was willing to chase her across continents, it meant they were close, too close, to something dangerous. A soft snap echoed in the distance. Snape's grip tightened on his wand. He did not move, did not even shift his breath. He simply listened. Another step. He flicked his wand soundlessly, vanishing the faint blue flames that had provided them warmth. The world plunged into absolute darkness. Elena stirred. "What?" Snape's hand clamped over her mouth. He leaned close, his breath barely above a whisper. "Not a word." She nodded, her body tense beneath his grip. Snape released her and rose to his feet, his movements precise and silent. He peered through the trees, his eyes accustomed to the darkness. A figure stood just beyond the tree-line, cloaked, watching. Snape raised his wand and, with a flick of his wrist, sent a silent stunner toward the intruder. The spell crackled through the air, only to be deflected mid-flight. The figure reacted fast, raising a hand as a surge of silver light shot towards Snape. He barely dodged, rolling to the side as the magic splintered the ground where he had been standing. Elena gasped. Snape fired another hex, but the figure twisted, disappearing behind the thick trees. Snape cursed under his breath. They weren't dealing with amateurs. "Elena, move," he ordered. She hesitated for only a second before scrambling to her feet. Snape grabbed her wrist and dragged her through the underbrush, moving fast, his mind working at impossible speeds. If the Order had found them, it meant their protections were failing. He needed to get her out now. A sudden voice cut through the night. Low, menacing. "You cannot run forever, Severus Snape." Snape halted. His blood ran cold. The voice was familiar. From the darkness emerged a second figure. Unlike the first, this one did not wear the traditional robes of the Order. Instead, they were clad in dark leather, a wand resting casually in their hand. Lucius Malfoy. Snape's grip on his wand tightened. "You're working with them?" Lucius smirked, stepping forward. "Come now, Severus. You didn't think you could disappear forever, did you?" His cold gaze flicked to Elena. "And what an interesting companion you've chosen." Snape didn't respond. He was calculating, analyzing. Lucius never did anything without reason. If he was here, it meant the Order had allies far beyond what Snape had anticipated. "I have no quarrel with you," Snape said, his voice even. "Walk away." Lucius chuckled. "You always were amusing. But I'm afraid I can't do that. The girl comes with me." Elena stiffened beside Snape. Snape exhaled slowly. "Then we have a problem." Lucius tilted his head. "It's not too late, Severus. You were always a survivor. Surrender her, and I will ensure your safety." Snape's wand never wavered. His voice, when he spoke, was ice. "You mistake me for someone who fears you, Lucius." Lucius' smirk faded. "So be it." With a flick of his wrist, he attacked. Snape was ready.